By the time I pulled into my driveway that evening, half of my backyard was already gone. Not stolen in some quiet, invisible way. Gone in the most insulting way possible, with fresh tire tracks carved through my grass. Broken fence posts stacked beside my garage, and a new wooden fence standing 6 feet inside the land I had paid for. The old line of cedar boards that had marked the back of my property for 12 years had been ripped out while I was at work. The soil was torn open. 2 young dogwood trees were snapped at the base. My sprinkler pipe was cracked and hissing into the mud like a wound. And standing near my back gate, arms folded, was Marlene Whiteaker, the HOA president, with 2 board members behind her like she had brought witnesses to my humiliation. She looked furious before I even said a word. Her face was red, her jaw tight, one hand gripping a folder of violation notices, while the other pointed toward my own yard, as if it belonged to her. She stepped closer, blocking the path to the new fence, and announced that the board had corrected a long-standing violation. According to her, my old fence had been out of alignment with the community standard, and the HOA had every right to move it. I remember looking past her at the raw strip of dirt where my yard used to be, 6 feet wide, almost 70 feet long. More than 400 square feet of my property had just been taken in a single afternoon by people who thought a board title gave them power over a deed. When I asked who authorized anyone to enter my land, Marlene slapped the folder against my gate hard enough to make the latch rattle. She warned me that if I interfered with the fence, refused to pay the contractor, or challenged the board, the HOA would add fines, legal fees, and possibly place a lien on my home. That was the moment I noticed the small red light on my rear security camera still blinking above the patio. Marlene did not know it yet, but that camera had recorded everything. The trucks, the workers, the board members, the moment they opened my gate, and the moment she pointed into my yard and directed them to move the fence inward. She thought she had just taught one homeowner a lesson. What she had actually done was create the evidence that would cost the HOA $48,000, expose an illegal fence, trigger a county investigation, and end her time as president in front of the entire neighborhood. Before that evening, I was not the kind of person anyone in the neighborhood would have described as difficult. I was the quiet guy in the blue ranch house at the end of Cedar Hollow Lane, the one who waved from the driveway, kept his grass trimmed, paid his HOA dues before the due date, and never showed up at board meetings unless there was a real reason. I worked as a maintenance technician at a county hospital, which meant most of my days started before sunrise and ended with tired hands, sore knees, and the smell of machine oil still clinging to my shirt. My job was not glamorous, but it was honest. I fixed electrical panels, repaired backup generators, checked air handlers, and crawled through mechanical rooms, so patients and nurses never had to think about what was keeping the building running. That house was the first thing in my life that truly felt like mine. I bought it after my mother passed away. She had spent the last few years of her life talking about small things she still wanted one day. Not expensive things, just peaceful ones. A back porch with 2 chairs, a little patch of grass where dogwoods could bloom in spring, a place where my father could sit in the shade without hearing traffic. When I signed the closing documents, I remember sitting alone in my truck in the title company parking lot, holding the keys and thinking that maybe I had finally managed to build something stable out of all the years of overtime and missed weekends. The backyard was the reason I chose that house. It was not huge, and it would never impress anyone looking for luxury, but it had a clean, rectangular shape, a gentle slope, and an old cedar fence that followed the rear property line. Behind it was a narrow drainage strip and then a line of common landscaping maintained by the HOA. To most people, that last stretch of grass probably looked unimportant to me. It mattered because every foot had been paid for, surveyed, insured, and recorded in the deed. I planted 2 dogwood trees near the back fence during my first spring. There they were small when I bought them, barely taller than my shoulder, but I liked checking on them after work. My mother had loved dogwoods. She used to say they made an ordinary yard feel like somebody had cared enough to leave beauty behind. So I watered them by hand at first, then installed a simple sprinkler line along the back edge of the yard when my father started visiting more often. I had planned to add a small stone path there, wide enough for him to walk with his cane when the grass was wet. That was why the fence mattered. It was not just boards and posts, it protected the quiet part of my life. It marked the line between what belonged to the neighborhood and what belonged to my family. For years, the HOA had been annoying but manageable. They sent reminders about trash cans left out too long, mailbox paint colors, and lawn height after heavy rain. I did not love it, but I understood what I had signed. I followed the rules because I wanted peace more than I wanted arguments. Everything changed when Marlene Whiteaker became HOA president. She ran for the board on a promise to restore community standards, raise property values, and clean up what she called years of careless ownership. At first, people clapped for that kind of language. It sounded responsible, it sounded professional, but once she had the title, the tone changed. Notices became sharper, fines came faster. The board emails started using phrases like enforcement action and non-compliance review. Neighbors stopped chatting near the mailboxes because everyone was afraid something they said would end up in a complaint. I still tried to stay out of it. I painted my fence when they asked. I replaced a cracked driveway panel. I even submitted an architectural request before changing my porch light fixture, even though the old one had been hanging by a wire. I kept telling myself that if I stayed polite, documented everything, and gave them no reason to target me, they would leave me alone. Anyone who has ever lived under an aggressive HOA knows how wrong that hope can be. If you have ever had someone act like a committee title gave them more power than your deed, then you already understand the feeling sitting in my stomach during those months. And if this story sounds familiar, it is worth sharing, because too many homeowners learn too late that being quiet does not always protect you. By the time Marlene first questioned my fence line, I had no idea she was not just looking for a violation. She was looking for land. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday, folded into a white envelope and tucked behind the little brass flag on my mailbox, like it was just another routine notice. At first, I almost ignored it. The HOA sent paper warnings for everything. Trash cans visible from the street, mulch color, weeds along the curb, holiday lights left up too long. I expected another reminder about something harmless. Instead, the letter said my rear fence was out of compliance because it was allegedly encroaching on community common area. I read that sentence 3 times at my kitchen counter while my work boots were still on. The claim made no sense. The fence had been there when I bought the house. The survey from closing showed it running along the rear property line. The previous owner had disclosed no dispute. The title company had flagged no issue. No neighbor had ever complained. For 12 years, that fence had simply existed as the legal boundary of my yard. I sent a polite email that same night. I attached a scanned copy of my survey, circled the rear boundary, and explained that the fence appeared to be inside my property line. I asked the board to send any documentation they had showing otherwise. I did not accuse anyone of lying. I did not threaten anyone. I assumed there had been a mistake. Marlene's reply came 2 days later. It did not include a survey, a plat map, or any county record. It simply stated that the board had reviewed the matter and determined that my fence disrupted the uniform appearance of the rear landscaping corridor. She wrote that the HOA expected correction within 15 days. That was the first time I realized she had changed the issue. The original notice had accused me of encroaching on common area. Now she was talking about appearance when I asked which rule allowed the HOA to move a property line based on appearance. There was no answer. There was only a fine. The first one was $250. Then another came for $500. Then a larger notice arrived stating that continued non-compliance could result in additional enforcement costs, contractor charges, attorney fees, and a lien assessment against my home. The language was cold and official, written to make a homeowner feel small before the fight even started. I requested a hearing in front of the board. That meeting was the moment I understood. This was not confusion, it was strategy. Marlene sat at the center table in the clubhouse with a thick binder in front of her and a little nameplate that seemed to matter more to her than any recorded deed. 2 board members sat beside her, nodding before I even spoke. I brought printed copies of my survey, the original subdivision plat from my closing packet, and photos of the fence line. I had organized everything in a folder because I still believed facts would matter. They barely looked at it. Marlene flipped through the first page, then pushed it back toward me as if it were a grocery receipt. She said the survey was old, that community standards had evolved, and that the board had authority to maintain consistent boundary aesthetics along the rear corridor. When I asked whether the HOA had commissioned a new survey, she said that was not necessary because the violation was visible. When I asked how something could be visible if it depended on a legal boundary underground, she smiled like I was wasting everyone's time. The worst part was not the fine. It was the way they spoke about my house while I was sitting right in front of them. They described my yard like a defect in their neighborhood plan. They referred to my fence as an obstacle. They said my refusal to cooperate was creating unnecessary tension. One board member suggested that homeowners sometimes became overly attached to small strips of land that did not affect the value of the home. The small strips of land. That was how they described the back edge of the property I had worked years to afford, the place where I had planted my mother's dogwoods, the strip where my father was supposed to have a path wide enough to walk safely. To them, it was small because it was not theirs. I left that meeting angry, but still careful. I wrote down everything I remembered as soon as I got home. I saved the notices. I saved the emails. I made copies of the fines. I told myself that as long as nobody touched the fence, this was still just paperwork. Then, the following Thursday, I got called into the hospital for an emergency repair. A backup cooling unit had failed near one of the operating wings, and I spent most of the day in a mechanical room with my phone on silent. By the time I checked it during a late lunch, I had 3 missed calls from a neighbor across the street, and one short message saying there were workers in my backyard. My stomach dropped before I even opened the security app. The camera feed showed a white contractor truck backed into my driveway. 2 men were carrying cedar panels across my lawn. My rear gate was wide open. The old fence posts were already being pulled out of the ground. Marlene stood near the back corner of my yard in a sun hat and white blouse, pointing at the grass, while the contractor measured inward from the old line. I called the HOA office. No answer. I called Marlene. No answer. I called the contractor number painted on the truck, and a man told me they were performing authorized HOA correction work when I said I was the property owner and had not authorized anyone to enter my land. His tone changed just enough to sound uncomfortable, but not enough to stop. He said the board had signed the work order, and any dispute would have to be taken up with them. By the time I got home, the damage was already done. The old fence was gone. The new one stood deep inside my yard, cutting off the dogwoods, the sprinkler line, and a long green strip of lawn as if someone had sliced my property with a knife. The contractors had left muddy tracks across the grass and a printed invoice clipped to my front door. The invoice listed the job as owner compliance correction and showed a balance due under my name. Marlene was still there. She did not apologize. She did not look embarrassed. She looked satisfied, like she had finally forced the neighborhood back into the shape she wanted. When I asked why workers had entered my locked backyard, she said the HOA had the right to cure violations when a homeowner refused. When I told her she had just moved a fence onto my land without consent, she said the board disagreed with my interpretation. My interpretation, that was what she called a deed, a survey, and 12 years of uncontested property ownership. Then she warned me that if I removed the new fence or refused to pay the invoice, the HOA would escalate the matter and add every cost to my account. One of the board members standing behind her added that fighting the HOA would be expensive, and most homeowners learned that too late. I looked at the broken dogwood trees, the cracked irrigation pipe, and the raw dirt where my real fence line used to be. I felt the kind of anger that makes your hands go still instead of shaking. For a few seconds, I wanted to tear the new fence down board by board and throw every piece into the common area they cared so much about. But I did not touch it, because right above the patio, my security camera was still blinking red, and unlike Marlene, it had no reason to lie. I did not sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same thing again, the raw dirt, the broken dogwoods. The new fence cutting through my own backyard like a line drawn by someone who thought my home was just an item on an HOA checklist. I wanted to go outside with a crowbar and undo what they had done before sunrise. I wanted Marlene to feel the same helplessness she had tried to force on me, but anger was exactly what they needed from me. If I tore down the fence, they would call me destructive. If I yelled at a board member, they would call me unstable. If I blocked the contractor from leaving or dragged the panels into the street, they would turn the story into a homeowner refusing compliance. So I made myself stand in the kitchen, breathe through the rage, and do the one thing Marlene clearly had not expected. I started building a file. The first thing I did was download every second of video from the cameras. The rear patio camera had the clearest angle. It showed the contractor truck entering my driveway just after 9 in the morning. It showed one worker testing my locked gate, then waiting while a board member came around the side yard. It showed Marlene standing near the fence line with her folder tucked under one arm, pointing toward the inside of my yard as the crew measured from the old cedar posts. The side camera showed workers carrying equipment through my property without permission. The doorbell camera caught the board members walking past my front porch before anyone knocked, as if they already knew I was not home. I copied the footage onto 2 separate drives. Then I uploaded it to cloud storage and labeled each file by date, time, and camera location. I had learned from years in hospital maintenance that records only matter if they are organized well enough for someone else to understand them later. A messy pile of evidence can look emotional. A clean timeline looks dangerous. Next, I photographed everything. I took wide shots of the backyard. From every corner, I photographed the cut ends of the old posts, the tire marks in the grass, the cracked irrigation pipe, the broken dogwood trunks, the mud around the new fence posts, and the invoice clipped to my front door. I placed a measuring tape across the stolen strip of yard and took photos showing the distance from the old post holes to the new fence. I even photographed the footprints near the gate because I wanted no one to pretend this was a misunderstanding handled from the common area. After that, I pulled out the paperwork from when I bought the house. The closing packet had been sitting in a plastic storage bin in my hall closet. For years, the kind of thing most homeowners keep but never expect to need. Inside were the deed, title policy, original survey, subdivision plat, HOA disclosure packet, and a stack of documents I had barely understood when I first signed them. That night I read them like my house depended on it. The survey showed the old fence line exactly where it had always been. The rear boundary ran straight across the back of my lot, and the fence sat just inside it. The subdivision plat showed something else I had not paid much attention to before. The drainage easement running behind my lot and along the rear edge of the neighborhood. It was not decorative common space. It was a recorded drainage corridor tied to the County S stormwater plan. That detail made my stomach tighten. If the new fence had been moved inward far enough to cross that area, Marlene had not just taken my grass, she may have interfered with a recorded easement. That meant the problem was bigger than an HOA rule. It touched county records, stormwater flow, and potentially code enforcement. I spent the next morning making calls during my break at the hospital. I contacted the county clerk and requested certified copies of the plat and any recorded easements tied to my address. I called the Building and Permits office to ask whether any fence permit had been issued for work at my property. The clerk could not give me legal advice, but she confirmed there was no record under my address for that week. Then I called a licensed surveyor, whose number came from a real estate attorney a coworker had used years earlier. The surveyor arrived 2 days later with equipment, flags, and the calm expression of a man who had seen enough property disputes to know people, lied more often than boundary markers did. He did not care about Marlene's emails or the HOA-S confidence. He cared about pins, records, measurements, and the legal description of the lot. He found the original markers, checked them against the plat, and began placing orange flags across the real rear boundary. By the time he finished, the truth was visible in the grass. The original fence had been right. The new fence was wrong. At the widest point, it sat more than 6 feet inside my property. It cut off a long strip of land that belonged to me and pushed the boundary close to the drainage easement shown in the county records. The surveyor told me he would prepare a written report with the measurements, diagrams, and photographs. But even before the report was finished, the orange flags told the whole story. I did not call Marlene. I did not send an angry email. I did not post about it in the neighborhood group. Instead, I made another folder, one section for the HOA notices, one for the fines, one for the hearing request, one for the board's written responses, one for the contractor invoice, one for the camera footage, one for county records, one for the new survey. I built a timeline from the first warning letter to the day the fence was moved, noting every date, every amount, every threat, and every time the HOA changed its explanation. Then I contacted an attorney who handled property disputes and HOA overreach. During our first meeting, I expected him to focus on the fence. Instead, he kept coming back to the same question, whether the HOA had written authorization to enter my land and remove improvements. I showed him the bylaws. I showed him the enforcement section. I showed him every notice they had sent. There were rules about fines, hearings, exterior standards, and maintenance. There was nothing giving the board the right to physically enter a homeowner's fenced backyard, remove a structure, damage landscaping, break irrigation, and bill the homeowner afterward without consent or a court order. The attorney's expression changed when he saw the video of Marlene directing the crew. That was the moment I understood why staying calm had mattered. I had not given them a scene. I had not given them an excuse. I had given them silence, paperwork, measurements, and video. While Marlene was acting like power came from a title. I was learning that real power comes from proof, and by the end of that week, the proof was no longer scattered across my kitchen table. It was ready to be used. The survey report arrived on a Friday afternoon while I was sitting in my truck outside the hospital, eating a cold sandwich before my second half of the shift. I opened the email expecting confirmation of what the orange flags had already shown me, but the numbers still hit harder than I expected. The new fence was not a few inches off. It was not a misunderstanding. At the widest point, the HOA had moved the fence 6.3 feet inside my recorded property line, over the full length of the backyard. That came out to more than 400 square feet of land cut away from my lot. The report included diagrams, measurements, photographs, and references to the recorded plat. It showed the original fence location, the legal boundary, and the new fence line like three separate truths laid over each other. The old fence had been right where it was supposed to be. The new fence was the lie. But the real twist was not the stolen grass. The real twist was the drainage easement. The surveyor's report confirmed that the new fence did not just reduce my yard. It interfered with the county-recorded stormwater drainage corridor behind the property. That easement had been created when the subdivision was approved, long before Marlene ever sat at the clubhouse table, pretending her title carried more weight than public records. It existed to keep stormwater moving safely through the rear of the lots and away from foundations, the patios, and neighboring yards. By moving the fence inward and setting new posts near the drainage path, the HOA had potentially obstructed part of a protected system. If heavy rain pushed debris against that fence, the water could back up into my yard and possibly into the yards beside mine. It was no longer just an argument between a homeowner and an HOA president. It was now a county issue. When I forwarded the report to my attorney, he called me less than 10 minutes later. His voice was calm, but I could hear the shift in it. Before the report, we had a strong property dispute. After the report, we had something much bigger. Unauthorized entry, removal of private property, damage to landscaping and irrigation, improper billing, possible violation of governing documents, and interference with a recorded drainage easement. He asked me again whether the HOA had ever produced written permission, a court order, a city approval, a county approval, or a signed agreement from me allowing them to enter my backyard. I told him no. Not once, not in a letter, not in an email, not at the hearing, not on the day the contractor showed up. Then he asked for the HOA bylaws again. That was where the second part of the trap closed. The bylaws allowed the HOA to send violation notices. They allowed hearings. They allowed fines after proper procedure, in some limited cases. They allowed the HOA to perform exterior maintenance on neglected property if the homeowner failed to act after written notice and access was lawful. But there was no language giving the board the right to enter a fenced, locked backyard, remove an existing structure, change a property boundary, damage improvements, and bill the owner for it, simply because the president did not like the way the fence lined up. Marlene had not enforced the rules. She had invented authority she did not have. My attorney prepared a demand letter that laid everything out in a way no board member could pretend not to understand. The HOA had 10 days to remove the new fence, restore the prior fence line according to the licensed survey, repair the irrigation damage, replace the dogwood trees, cancel all fines and enforcement charges, reimburse my survey costs, preserve all communications related to the fence work, and provide the name of the contractor, the signed work order, and any insurance carrier involved. He also warned them not to destroy emails, meeting notes, text messages, invoices, or internal board communications. That single paragraph mattered more than I realized at the time. It meant the story could no longer be rewritten casually at the next meeting. Every message, every instruction, every vote, and every excuse could become evidence. Marlene responded 2 days later from her HOA email account. She did not apologize. She did not ask to inspect the records. She did not offer to pause enforcement while the issue was reviewed. Instead, she wrote that the board did not recognize my private survey, that the HOA had acted within its authority to maintain community standards, and that any continued refusal to comply would result in additional legal and administrative charges. It was the kind of email that probably felt powerful when she typed it. To my attorney, it was a gift, because in one message, Marlene confirmed that the board knew about the dispute, knew I had a survey, knew I objected to the work, and still intended to punish me for resisting. She also put in writing that the HOA believed it could override recorded property documents with something as vague as community standards. That was when we sent the full packet to the county. The packet included the licensed survey, the subdivision plat, the recorded drainage easement, photographs of the new fence posts, the contractor invoice, the HOA notices, Marlene S. email, and still images from the security camera showing the crew entering my yard. We also sent a separate notice to the Contractor S insurance company because their workers had entered private property and removed improvements without confirming owner consent. For the first time since this started, I did not feel like I was defending myself. I felt like the facts had finally turned around and started walking toward Marlene. The HOA had spent weeks treating me like a homeowner who did not understand power. But power was never in Marlene S. folder, her fines or her threats about liens. It was in the county records she never bothered to read. It was in the survey markers she thought she could ignore. It was in the bylaws she assumed nobody would check. And it was in the camera footage of her standing in my backyard, pointing at my land, directing workers to take what was not hers. By the time the county inspector called to schedule a site visit, Marlene had stopped copying the full board on her emails. That told me she finally understood something was wrong. But she still did not understand how public it was about to become. The county inspector arrived on a gray Monday morning with a clipboard, a tablet, and the kind of calm face that makes nervous people talk too much. A drainage inspector came with him, along with a code enforcement officer who had already reviewed the plat map before stepping onto the property. My attorney stood beside me near the patio, holding a folder that was much thinner than Marlene S. binder had been, but far more dangerous. Marlene showed up 10 minutes late with 2 board members and the contractor owner she was dressed like. It was another HOA hearing, carrying herself with that same stiff confidence. But the moment she saw the orange survey flags still planted across my yard, her expression changed. The flags made the truth physical. They turned legal language into something everyone could see. The inspector did not care about community standards. He did not ask whether the fence looked uniform from the common area. He walked the line slowly, checked the surveyor-s markings, compared them to the county plat on his tablet, and took photos from every angle. The drainage inspector paid special attention to the new fence posts near the rear corridor. He measured the distance, checked the slope, and studied the way water would move if a heavy storm came through. For the first time, Marlene had no room to control the conversation when she tried to frame it as an internal HOA compliance issue. A code enforcement officer reminded her that a recorded drainage easement was not controlled by the HOA board. When she suggested my survey might be disputed, the county inspector noted that her board had not produced any competing survey, permit, written authorization, or property owner consent. When the contractor claimed he had only followed HOA instructions, the officer asked for the signed access approval from the actual property owner. There was none that silence did more damage than any argument I could have made. The sheriff's deputy arrived shortly after to take a report for unauthorized entry and property damage. He was not there to stage a dramatic arrest, and I never expected that. But his presence changed the energy immediately. The contractor owner stopped acting annoyed and started choosing his words carefully. One board member stepped away to make a phone call. Marlene stood rigid near the new fence, staring at the ground as the deputy documented the video footage, the broken irrigation pipe, the removed fence posts, and the invoice that had been billed to me after the work was done without my consent. By the end of the site visit, the county had issued written findings requiring the obstruction near the drainage easement to be corrected. The HOA was instructed to remove the improperly placed fence, restore the area, and submit proof that any future work near the easement would comply with county requirements. Code enforcement also opened a review of whether the contractor had performed work without proper verification and whether the HOA had misrepresented its authority over private property. But the most satisfying part came a week later. At the emergency HOA meeting, the clubhouse was packed. People who had ignored years of fines and petty notices suddenly showed up because this was no longer gossip. It was money. It was liability. It was their dues being used to defend a decision the board had no right to make. I did not speak first. My attorney did. He laid out the timeline without raising his voice. The first notice, my survey response, the fines, the hearing, the contractor work order, the camera footage, the county plat, the drainage easement, and the inspector's findings. Each document landed harder than the last. The room grew quieter as residents realized this was not one homeowner being stubborn. This was the board using HOA funds to enter private land, damage property, create a county violation, and then bill the victim for it. Marlene tried to defend herself by saying she had acted in the best interest of the community. But that phrase had lost all power. The community was sitting right in front of her, and they were angry. One resident asked why the board had not ordered a survey before spending HOA money. Another asked why members had been told I was refusing to fix a violation, when the county now said the fence was in the wrong place. Someone else asked whether their dues would be used to pay legal damages. That was when the board members began separating themselves from Marlene. They claimed they had not understood the property line issue. They said they believed the contractor had verified access. They said they had relied on Marlene's representation. The contractor blamed the HOA blamed the contractor. Marlene blamed old records, unclear maps, and my supposed unwillingness to cooperate. But the camera footage ended that. When the still image appeared showing Marlene standing inside my backyard, pointing toward my land, while the workers measured inward from the original fence line, the room went completely still. No one needed a legal degree to understand what they were seeing. For weeks, she had acted like power meant being louder, colder, and more threatening than the homeowner in front of her. But once the county, the sheriff, the inspector, the attorney, and the records all stood on the same side, her authority collapsed into paperwork. And paperwork, unlike Marlene, did not blink. The final cost did not come all at once. It arrived in pieces, like the neighborhood slowly realizing that Marlene's confidence had been writing checks the HOA could not afford. First, the fines against me were canceled. Every violation notice, every late fee, every administrative charge tied to the fence disappeared from my account. Then the HOA's attorney advised the board to settle, before the case became more expensive and more public. They agreed to pay for the removal of the illegal fence, the reconstruction of my original fence along the surveyed property line, the repair of the irrigation system, the replacement of the 2 dogwood trees, the licensed survey, part of my attorney's fees, and additional compensation for the damage to my yard. By the time the invoices, insurance deductibles, legal fees, contractor corrections, and county compliance costs were added together, the total came to just over $48,000. The fence company did not escape cleanly either. Their owner had tried to claim they were only following HOA instructions, but the county made it clear that a contractor working on private property still had a duty to verify access and authority. They lost their yearly maintenance contract with the HOA, and their insurance carrier became involved in the damage claim. The owner later sent me a stiff apology letter that sounded like it had been written by 3 lawyers and 1 terrified accountant. Marlene S. Fall was quieter, but somehow more satisfying. At the next special meeting, residents voted to remove her as HOA president. She sat in the front row, with her arms crossed, staring straight ahead while people who once nodded along with her enforcement speeches now demanded spending records, legal explanations, and a review of every fine issued under her leadership. The board was forced to adopt a new rule requiring a licensed survey and written homeowner consent before any action involving a property line. They also had to send a community-wide letter admitting that the fence work had been improperly authorized. The day my fence was rebuilt, I stood in the backyard and watched the crew set the posts exactly where the orange survey flags had been. The yard looked scarred for a while. The grass had to be reseeded. The sprinkler trench had to be filled. The new dogwoods were smaller than the ones I lost, and I knew it would take years before they looked right again. But the line was back. That mattered more than anything. I never wanted a war with my HOA. I wanted a quiet home, a safe yard, and the right to stand on land I had paid for, without someone pretending a board title could erase my deed. In the end, I did not win because I shouted louder than Marlene. I did not win because I threatened anyone or played dirty. I won because I stayed calm when they wanted me emotional, kept records when they expected me to give up, and let the survey, the camera footage, the county, and the law speak louder than their threats. So if you ever find yourself facing an HOA, a neighbor, or a contractor who thinks your property rights are negotiable, remember this. Do not just argue, document, photograph, save every notice. Read the bylaws, check the county records. Then never assume that the loudest person in the room is the one with the strongest case. Sometimes the most powerful line on your property is not the fence. It is the paper trail proving where that fence belongs. And if this story made you think of something happening in your own neighborhood, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and keep it saved for the day you might need to protect your own boundary the right way.